The house felt unnaturally quiet. Too quiet. My husband had left early that morning for his trip, and for the first time in months, it was just me and his son under one roof. The silence wasn't peaceful. It pressed down like a heavy blanket. I stood in the middle of our cluttered bedroom, sorting through a pile of clothes I hadn't touched in ages. Old sweaters with missing buttons, jeans that no longer fit. The scent of cedar from the storage bins filled the air. Then, as I reached for the last item in the pile, my fingers brushed against something soft, silky, almost luxurious. I pulled it out, a deep red dress with a tag still attached. I had splurged on it months ago, convincing myself I'd find the right occasion to wear it. But life had a funny way of keeping me too busy for dinners out or anything worth dressing up for. The sunlight streaming through the window caught the fabric, making it shimmer. For a moment I forgot myself. I slipped the dress on, smoothing it over my hips. The material hugged me perfectly. I caught my reflection in the mirror and barely recognized the woman staring back. She looked poised, confident. I barely had time to process the thought before the door creaked behind me. I froze, my pulse skipping like a faulty record player. I spun around, clutching the sides of the dress. There he was, my husband's son, standing in the doorway. His eyes widened, and his face flushed deep red as though he'd walked in on something private. I was looking for the kitchen towels, he stammered, his gaze shifting to the floor. My heart was pounding in my ears. There. Probably on the counter, I said, sharper than I meant. He nodded but didn't move. The silence between us grew unbearable, stretched too thin to be normal. Finally, he mumbled an apology I could barely hear and turned to leave. His footsteps faded down the hall, leaving the door ajar. I stayed frozen for a long moment, staring at the empty doorway. My hands were still gripping the dress as if it could somehow shield me from the awkwardness that had just unfolded. I told myself it was nothing, an innocent mistake. But my chest felt tight, like I couldn't quite catch my breath. I peeled off the dress and stuffed it into the back of the closet, as if hiding it could erase the moment. I went through the rest of the day on autopilot. Laundry, dishes, wiping down counters that were already spotless. But my mind kept circling back to the way his eyes had lingered a second too long, the way his face flushed like he'd been caught somewhere he shouldn't be. By the time evening rolled around, I was exhausted. Not from work, but from overthinking. I tried distracting myself with TV, flipping through channels just for noise. But even that didn't help. Every creak in the house felt louder. Every shadow in the hallway seemed longer. I didn't see him again that night. He stayed in his room and I stayed in mine, each of us retreating to our corners like strangers, avoiding the shared space we were supposed to call home. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, my thoughts a tangled mess. Boundaries. They'd always seemed so clear to me. Lines you didn't cross, rules you followed. But now, those lines felt blurry, like someone had erased them with the back of their hand. Tomorrow will be different, I whispered to myself in the dark. I promised I'd fix whatever had gone wrong. But deep down, a small voice in the back of my mind whispered something else entirely. What if it wasn't nothing? That thought lingered as I closed my eyes, the quiet house wrapping around me like a cold reminder that some moments, no matter how small, have the power to shift everything. The next morning, the house felt heavier, as though the walls themselves had absorbed the tension. I busied myself with small tasks, wiping down the countertops, reorganizing the pantry, folding more laundry than I thought we even owned. I hadn't seen him since yesterday's awkward encounter. His door remained firmly shut. No faint music playing from his speakers, no muffled footsteps. Usually, he'd be in the kitchen by now, scrolling through his phone with a bowl of cereal in front of him. But today, just silence. I lingered in the hallway longer than I should have, staring at his door, debating whether to knock. Felt ridiculous. We were adults, living under the same roof. Why should I feel nervous about a simple knock? I finally mustered the courage and tapped lightly. "Hey, you okay in there?" My voice sounded too soft, too careful. There was a pause before a muffled, "Yeah, fine." It didn't sound fine. His voice was distant, like he was somewhere far away. My hand hovered over the doorknob, but something in me stopped. I told myself to give him space. Everyone needs space, right? Especially after something awkward. I backed away and headed to the kitchen. The rhythmic chopping of vegetables was oddly soothing, something to drown out the quiet. I decided to make lasagna. It was comforting, familiar. Maybe food could bridge the strange gap between us. The smell of garlic and baked tomatoes filled the kitchen as I set the table. Plates, glasses, utensils. All perfectly in place, as if I could will normalcy back into the house. The sound of his door opening made me look up. He appeared in the doorway, his steps slow, almost hesitant. He avoided my gaze, heading straight for the fridge. "Hey," I greeted, keeping my tone light. "Hungry?" He shrugged, grabbing a bottle of water. "Not really." I studied him for a moment. The flushed cheeks, the way his shoulders seemed tense, like he was carrying something invisible but heavy. I wanted to ask what's really going on, but the words caught in my throat. "Dinner will be ready in 20 minutes, I offered instead. "Cool." He turned to leave. "Wait." The word escaped before I could stop it. He froze, his back to me. My stomach tightened. "Are you sure you're okay? You've been quiet today." He turned around slowly. For a moment, I thought he was going to say something meaningful, let it out, but instead he just shook his head. "I'm fine." His voice was barely above a whisper. And just like that, he was gone again, disappearing back into his room, leaving me alone in the kitchen with the smell of baked pasta and the unsettling knot of worry in my chest. The lasagna sat untouched on the table, its golden crust growing cold. I picked at my own plate, but everything tasted bland, like I'd forgotten to season it. Or maybe it was the weight of everything making it hard to care. After I cleared the dishes, I threw myself into cleaning the house. Anything to keep my hands busy and my mind from spiraling. That's when I noticed his phone, left on the couch. The screen lit up briefly with a notification. I hesitated, telling myself I shouldn't look. It wasn't my place. But curiosity tugged at me. I reached for it, intending to set it aside, but froze when I saw the message preview. "I can't stop thinking about it." My stomach tightened. The words felt too close, too specific. I told myself not to jump to conclusions. It could have been anything. But the message hung in the air, heavy and unsettling. I placed the phone back where I found it, forcing myself to move on. But the unease lingered, like a splinter too deep to pull out. Later that night, as I passed his room, I saw the faint glow of light under the door. I stood there, debating whether to knock again or let it go. In the end, I walked away. But sleep didn't come easy. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, replaying that message over and over in my mind. What did it mean? Was it about me? Was I imagining things? The silence between us wasn't just awkward anymore. It was something else entirely. And I hated how much it was starting to consume me. The morning sun streamed through the windows, but it felt pale and distant, as if it had forgotten how to bring warmth. I sat at the kitchen table, staring at the coffee cup in front of me. It had gone cold, just like everything else in this house. I couldn't take another day of that silence creeping through the walls like a slow leak. By mid-morning I made a choice. I knocked softly on his door, more out of habit than courage. A muffled sound came from the other side, and before I could talk myself out of it, I opened the door a few inches. He was sitting on the bed, headphones resting around his neck. His phone was in his hand, but his thumb didn't move to scroll. His face had that distant, weighted look, one I recognized because I'd felt it too. "I'm heading to the backyard," I said, trying to make it sound like an invitation rather than a request. The last thing I needed was another day of stale air and silence. Pause, and then he stood up. His movements were slow, cautious, like he wasn't sure he wanted to leave the room at all. Outside, the sun was warmer than I expected, the air thick with the smell of damp earth. I grabbed a pair of gloves and handed another pair to him. We worked in silence at first. There was something calming about the pull of weeds and the dull scrape of a spade hitting the soil. It wasn't long before the quiet changed. Not the heavy kind from inside, but something easier. We were close enough to hear each other breathe, but far enough that words weren't necessary. I focused on the roots tangled in the dirt. Time passed in pieces. The shift of sunlight, the distant hum of a lawnmower from the next street over, the soft clink of metal against stone. And then, just like that, the air shifted again, this time sharper. I looked up and caught the way he had stopped, how his shoulders seemed heavier than before. Everything in me screamed to leave it alone, to fill the silence with something harmless and keep moving. But something else, something deeper, kept me rooted in place. I saw it in his eyes before I could stop it. He stepped forward, not fast, not slow, like the ground between us wasn't solid. And then there was no space left. His lips touched mine, not with force or certainty, but with the quiet weight of things unspoken. My breath hitched, and for a moment, the world narrowed to nothing but the breeze and the hum of my pulse in my ears. Then the moment broke. I pulled back, reality flooding in like ice water. He didn't say a word. Neither did I. We just stood there, hearts pounding in the space between us. The garden that had felt so safe only minutes ago now felt unbearably small. I dropped my gloves onto the dirt and turned toward the house. My legs felt shaky, but I forced myself to walk inside to find something, anything to ground me again. The kitchen was dimmer now, the sunlight filtering through the curtains like dust. I leaned against the counter and stared out the window at the place we'd left behind. The neat rows of soil and half-pulled weeds seemed like a different world entirely. I ran my hands under cold water, watching the soil from my fingers swirl and disappear down the drain. I didn't recognize the reflection in the window. My face looked unfamiliar, more vulnerable than I ever wanted to admit. The house was silent again, but this time it wasn't just quiet. It felt like something had shifted in its very foundation. Something we couldn't put back. The coffee I'd left on the counter hours ago was still there, forgotten. I poured it down the sink, the sound of it swirling away filling the emptiness for a brief moment before the silence returned. And in that silence, I felt the question echoing louder than ever. What now? The rest of the day passed in fragments, sounds of doors opening and closing, water running, the hum of the fridge. But none of it felt real. I moved through the house like a ghost, wiping the same countertop twice, folding the same hand towel just to keep my hands from trembling. He stayed in his room. I could feel his presence even without hearing him. The house wasn't big enough to hide from something like this. I sat at the dining table, staring at the empty plates I had set out earlier. The lasagna from yesterday was still in the fridge, untouched. My stomach twisted with guilt and something else I couldn't name. I was waiting for a sign that this mess could be cleaned up like a spill on the floor. Hours passed. Outside, the afternoon sun dimmed into a pale dusk. The sky turned that soft, hazy blue that signals the end of a long day. The house grew colder, shadows stretching in the corners. Eventually I made myself move. I reheated the lasagna, set the table again, and waited. The minutes felt longer than they should have, dragging out in an almost cruel way. Finally I heard footsteps behind me. He walked into the kitchen slowly, like he wasn't sure if he was welcome. His face was drawn, his eyes downcast. I didn't say anything. I didn't trust my voice not to crack. I motioned toward the plate I'd set for him. He hesitated before sitting down. We ate in silence, the sound of forks scraping against porcelain filling the space between us. The food tasted like nothing, but I forced it down. After a few bites, he pushed his plate away and rested his hands in his lap, eyes still lowered. I wanted to reach across the table, to pull this situation back into something manageable. But the space between us wasn't physical, it was something deeper. The hum of the fridge filled the quiet as I cleared the plates. My hands shook slightly as I rinsed the dishes. I felt his gaze on me, even if he never looked directly. When I finally turned around, the chair was empty. He was gone, back behind the closed door of his room. I leaned against the sink, letting the cold water run over my hands until they went numb. It didn't help. I moved through the living room, straightening pillows that didn't need straightening, picking up blankets just to fold them again. Anything to avoid thinking about that moment in the garden. How everything shifted in a single breath. His phone was on the couch again, glowing faintly from a new message. I forced myself not to look, not to let curiosity lead me into a place I didn't belong. But the memory of that first message, I can't stop thinking about it, replayed in my mind like a scratch on a record. I turned away and headed toward my room, but the quiet followed me like a shadow. I lay on the bed, staring at the ceiling, hoping for sleep that never came. Hours later, the house was still dark. The clock on my nightstand read past midnight when I heard the faintest creak of floorboards outside my door. I held my breath, straining to listen. The sound faded, replaced by the soft click of his door closing. My chest felt heavy, not from fear, but from something far more complicated. The kind of weight you can't shake, no matter how hard you try. I closed my eyes and tried to convince myself that tomorrow would be different. But even as I whispered that thought in my mind, I knew it wasn't true. Some things don't go back to normal, no matter how much you want them to. The house settled into silence again, but it wasn't the calm kind. It was the type of silence that makes you feel like something is coming, something inevitable. And all you can do is wait. Morning arrived with a dull gray sky, matching the weight that pressed down on me. I brewed a fresh pot of coffee, though I barely wanted any. The simple routines, pouring, stirring, sipping, felt mechanical, as if pretending everything was normal might eventually make it true. Then I heard the familiar sound of the front door opening. I froze mid-sip. He wasn't supposed to be back yet. My husband stepped inside, suitcase in hand. His eyes lit up when he saw me. "Surprise," he said with a grin, setting his bag down. The breath caught in my throat. I forced a smile, trying to cover the wave of unease that washed over me. He stepped forward and wrapped his arms around me. His embrace was warm, familiar, the kind that used to make me feel safe. I let myself sink into it for a brief second before the guilt crawled back. He pulled away just enough to kiss me, slow and deliberate, as if he'd missed me more than he could admit. The gesture was gentle, grounding. For a second I clung to the idea that this was what I needed to reset everything. But behind him, down the hall, I noticed the barely open door. And I knew. He'd heard my husband's voice. He knew he was back. My husband stepped back and stretched. I couldn't wait another day. Cancelled the last meeting and took the first flight home. His voice was so casual, so normal. Felt like we lived in different realities. I asked how his trip went, trying to steer the conversation anywhere else. He told me about delayed flights and office politics, and I nodded in all the right places. Inside I felt like I was balancing on a wire, one wrong move away from falling. After breakfast, he took his suitcase to our bedroom while I cleaned up the table. The clinking of dishes felt deafening in the otherwise quiet house. I turned on the faucet, letting the sound of running water drown out my thoughts. Then I heard the faint creak of footsteps behind me. I didn't have to turn around to know it was him. My stepson, standing there just outside the doorway. For a moment, I imagined what he must have been thinking. Everything unspoken between us felt like a pressure valve ready to burst. I finished rinsing the last plate and shut off the water. I could feel his gaze pressing into my back. But when I finally turned around, the hallway was empty again. The day stretched on like a rubber band pulled too tight. My husband unpacked, talking about his plans for the week ahead, unaware of the storm brewing beneath the surface. By late afternoon, he suggested a family dinner at home, something nice and quiet after his trip. He meant well. I nodded and agreed, even though the idea of us all sitting around the same table felt unbearable. I cooked as if on autopilot, roasted chicken, mashed potatoes, something simple yet comforting. As the smell filled the house, I heard them both moving around, one in the bedroom, the other in his room down the hall. When it was time to eat, the three of us sat together at the table for the first time in what felt like forever. My husband was relaxed, cheerful even, filling the silence with small talk about his trip. I nodded, offering smiles when appropriate. My stepson stayed quiet, his gaze fixed on his plate, cutting his food into small pieces but barely eating. I could feel the cracks beneath the surface, each word from my husband like a gentle tap, each silence like pressure against something fragile. I wasn't sure who was holding more in, him or me. After dinner, I stayed in the kitchen to clean while my husband retreated to the living room to relax. My stepson disappeared down the hallway again, his door closing with a soft click. The clinking of dishes was all I had left to focus on as I scrubbed and rinsed. The quiet between these walls was louder than any argument could have been. When the last dish was dried, I leaned against the counter, staring at nothing. My husband's laughter from the other room echoed faintly, a sound I'd once loved, now hollow against the weight of everything left unsaid. I wanted to believe we could hold it all together, but I could feel it. Something was slipping. The morning felt heavy, like the house had absorbed every unspoken word from the night before. My husband left early to run errands, giving me a few precious hours of quiet. The sound of the front door closing echoed through the house, leaving me alone again, but not really. I poured another cup of coffee and leaned against the kitchen counter, staring blankly out the window. The backyard was still a mess from yesterday. Half-weeded soil, forgotten tools. It looked as tangled as my thoughts. His door was still shut. Part of me wanted to knock, to have some kind of resolution, but the other part of me was terrified of what that conversation might uncover. The line between us felt like a canyon now, wide and impossible to cross. I cleaned up the kitchen, more out of habit than necessity. The sound of dishes clinking was the only thing keeping me from unraveling completely. But it wasn't long before I heard the door behind me open, soft but unmistakable. He walked into the room slowly, his eyes flicking toward the coffee pot and then to me. His face looked tired, like he'd barely slept. Felt the same way. I didn't speak. I just set another mug on the counter and slid it toward him. He hesitated for a second before pouring himself a cup. The small, everyday motion felt strangely significant. He didn't sit. He stayed by the counter, one hand wrapped around the mug, the other stuffed in his pocket. The space between us felt like a thread pulled tight, ready to snap. I turned away, pretending to straighten a stack of papers that didn't need straightening. The silence pressed down, but I couldn't bring myself to fill it. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw him shift his weight. I need to get out of here for a while. The words were soft but deliberate, cutting through the quiet like a knife. I didn't turn around right away. I wasn't sure I trusted my expression to stay neutral. When I finally faced him, he wasn't looking at me, just staring down at the dark surface of his coffee. I nodded slowly. Maybe that's a good idea. He exhaled like he'd been holding his breath. I can't stay in this house. Not like this. His voice was calm, almost resigned, and that scared me more than anything else. I searched for something to say, but everything felt wrong, either too much or not enough. Cleared my throat. What do you need? He shook his head, eyes still downcast. The word felt final, like a door closing between us. I pressed my palms against the counter to ground myself. The coffee in my mug was growing cold, but I didn't dare take another sip. I didn't argue. I didn't ask him to stay. I wasn't sure if it was because I wanted to give him what he needed or because I was too afraid of his answer if I did. He set his mug down and stepped back, his movements slow and deliberate. I heard his door close again a few seconds later, the soft click sending an ache straight to my chest. I stayed in the kitchen for a long time, staring at the place where he'd stood. The morning light shifted across the floor, and outside, the world moved on as if nothing had happened. By mid-afternoon my husband was back, arms full of grocery bags and energy I couldn't match. He kissed my cheek and launched into a story about someone he'd run into at the store. His voice was bright, full of life, so unaware of the cracks in the foundation beneath us. I forced a smile, nodding at the right moments, but I barely heard a word. Later, while putting away the groceries, I found myself pausing every time I reached for a cabinet. The weight in my chest hadn't lifted, it had grown. I could feel it pressing down, making every movement feel slower, heavier. Dinner that night was painfully quiet. My husband noticed the empty chair at the table but didn't comment. Instead, he asked if everything was okay. I nodded and gave a half-hearted excuse. He didn't push for details. After the plates were cleared and the kitchen was quiet again, I found myself standing in the hallway, staring at his door. I raised my hand to knock but stopped just short. I didn't know what I expected. Maybe I just needed to know if he was still on the other side. But the thought of opening that door, of facing whatever waited beyond it, made my heart race. In the end, I walked away. The weight of what hadn't been said followed me like a shadow. Some distances couldn't be crossed, not because they were too far, but because neither side knew how to take the first step. The next morning was painfully ordinary, the kind of day that feels wrong in its normalcy when everything inside you is unraveling. My husband left early again, promising he'd be back in time for dinner. His cheerful goodbye barely registered. I watched him walk out the door with his usual confidence, while I stayed behind with everything unsaid, hanging like thick fog in the air. The quiet settled in almost immediately after he left. The sound of the door closing echoed through the house before giving way to that familiar, crushing silence. I stood there for a moment, letting it wash over me before I forced myself to move. I cleaned the kitchen again, though it didn't need it. I wiped down counters that were already spotless and swept a floor that didn't have a speck of dust. It wasn't about cleanliness. It was about control, about keeping my hands busy so my mind wouldn't spiral. But no amount of scrubbing could dull the memory of his words from the day before. I need space. The way he said it played on a loop in my head, each replay sharper than the last. By late morning, the quiet became unbearable. I found myself walking down the hallway, stopping in front of his door. I wasn't sure what I was hoping for, that he'd say something first, that he'd tell me everything was fine. None of that seemed realistic. I raised my hand to knock but hesitated again. Instead, I whispered, barely audible even to myself, "Are you okay?" There was no response. The door stayed closed. I stepped back, frustration bubbling up inside me. Was this how it was going to be? Doors between us, silence filling the cracks. I couldn't live like that, trapped in some endless, polite distance. By the time noon rolled around, I made a decision I wasn't sure I'd regret or not. I walked to his room and opened the door without knocking. He was sitting on the edge of his bed, headphones around his neck, his phone in his hand. He didn't flinch or seem surprised to see me standing there. He looked tired, bone-tired, like someone carrying the weight of things they didn't know how to put down. For a moment, we just stared at each other, the quiet between us sharp as glass. "I can't do this," I said, breaking the silence. My voice wasn't as steady as I wanted it to be. "I can't pretend things are fine." His eyes flickered with something. Recognition, guilt, maybe both. He set the phone down slowly, like he knew something important was coming. "I've been trying to figure it out," he finally said, his voice low. "But I don't know how." There it was, the truth neither of us wanted to admit. We were both stuck, unsure how to navigate what had happened. "You can't keep hiding," I said, my voice softer now. "And neither can I." He stood up, closing the small distance between us. My pulse raced, but I forced myself to stand my ground. The room felt smaller, the air thick with the weight of everything unspoken. He wasn't angry, just broken the way I felt too. "I thought this would get easier," he said, his words barely more than a whisper. The honesty in his voice was like a punch to the gut. I swallowed hard, fighting the emotions that threatened to rise. "It never does," I said, more to myself than to him. "But we have to stop pretending we can just ignore it." He nodded, but the look in his eyes told me he didn't know how. And neither did I. I stepped back, breaking the tense moment before it could tip into something else. The movement felt final, like closing a chapter that neither of us was ready to finish. You need space, I said, not as a question but as a statement. He nodded again. Then take it. My voice didn't shake this time. I turned and walked out, leaving the door open behind me. I wanted him to know that it didn't have to stay closed. Back in the kitchen, I leaned against the counter, staring at the same spot I had the day before. The house felt heavier now, as if it was bracing itself for something to break. And deep down, I knew that something wasn't just the silence. It was us. Dinner was supposed to be simple. Just the three of us, a quiet night to settle the tension in the air. I roasted chicken, mashed potatoes, steamed vegetables. Comfort food, something familiar to fill the gaps where words couldn't. I told myself that if I made everything perfect, maybe it would feel normal again. By the time the table was set, my husband had already poured himself a glass of wine. He leaned against the counter, scrolling through his phone and occasionally making small comments about work. His voice was steady, his presence warm. I nodded when appropriate, but my mind was elsewhere. The door at the end of the hall opened. I heard the soft sound of his footsteps before I saw him. He walked into the kitchen, his face blank, guarded. He took his usual seat at the table, and for a moment everything seemed almost ordinary. But it wasn't. The air between us was thick with everything we hadn't said. My husband didn't seem to notice, pouring water into our glasses, offering to carve the chicken. He filled the silence with stories from his trip, jokes about airport delays. I forced a smile, though my throat felt tight. The clinking of silverware filled the room. My stepson barely touched his food, cutting the chicken into small pieces but never really eating. I could feel him watching me when my husband wasn't looking. Every glance felt like a reminder of the mess we'd created. Halfway through the meal, my husband set his fork down and looked at both of us. "Is everything okay?" His voice was light, but there was a hint of suspicion beneath it, like he was finally noticing the distance between us. I nodded too quickly. "Course. Just tired." My stepson kept his gaze on his plate, offering no confirmation or denial. The silence stretched until my husband chuckled awkwardly, trying to break the tension. He poured himself another glass of wine and changed the subject. I barely heard him. When dinner was over, I stood to clear the dishes. My stepson pushed his chair back and headed down the hall without a word, his door closing softly behind him. My husband lingered in the kitchen, sipping his wine and watching me. "You've been quiet," he said, setting his glass down. "Just tired," I repeated. It was the safest excuse I had. He watched me for a moment longer, then leaned in to kiss me. It was soft, familiar, the kind of kiss meant to remind me of everything we'd built together. But instead of comfort, it felt like a spotlight on the guilt I carried. I closed my eyes and let it happen, hoping I could pretend everything was fine. But the weight in my chest didn't lift. It grew heavier. When he pulled away, he smiled softly. "I'll be in the living room." He ran his hand down my arm before stepping away, leaving me alone with the dishes and the deafening silence. I scrubbed the plates harder than necessary, letting the hot water sting my hands. The sound of the TV flickering on in the other room barely registered. I dried the last dish and set it aside before stepping back and staring at the empty sink. I told myself I wouldn't check. I told myself I wouldn't give in to curiosity, wouldn't let myself spiral. But my feet moved before my brain could stop them. I walked down the hall and paused outside his door. The light underneath the frame was dim, but I knew he was still awake. My hand hovered in the air, ready to knock, but something in me hesitated. Instead, I leaned closer, hearing the faint hum of a voice. His, quiet but urgent. A chill ran down my spine. He was on the phone. I shouldn't have listened. I knew that. But the words drifted through the thin wooden door like they were meant for me to hear. "I can't stay here," he whispered. "It's too much." My stomach twisted, and my breath caught in my throat. The truth was right there, raw and unfiltered. I stepped back, my pulse hammering in my ears. The hallway felt longer, darker. I turned and walked toward my room, my legs unsteady. When I reached the doorway, I saw my husband stretched out on the couch, half watching some crime drama. He looked over and smiled, patting the cushion next to him. "Come sit." I forced myself to smile back and sat beside him. He draped an arm over my shoulder, pulling me close. I tried to focus on the warmth of his touch, on the sound of the TV, on anything but the storm inside me. But I knew. Whatever thread had been holding us together was unraveling, and there was no way to stop it. The walls felt thinner, the spaces between us wider. And as I sat there pretending everything was fine, I realized something chilling. The worst wasn't coming, it was already here. The next morning the house felt colder, even though the heat had kicked on overnight. The vents hummed softly, pushing out warm air, but it didn't touch the chill in the air. I woke early, the ache of restless sleep clinging to me. My husband was still asleep, his deep, steady breathing filling the quiet of our room. I wrapped myself in a sweater and padded down the hallway, stopping instinctively outside his door. The light was off, and there was no sound from the other side. But something felt off, a strange stillness that unsettled me. I hesitated for a moment before pushing the door open. His room was empty. The bed was neatly made, his backpack was gone, and the windows were slightly open, letting in a cold draft. My breath caught. I stepped inside, scanning the space, hoping I'd missed something, anything. But the room was stripped of life. The chair in the corner, where his sweatshirt always hung, was bare. The desk where his books were scattered last night was now spotless. Then I saw it, a folded piece of paper sitting on his pillow. My chest tightened as I reached for it. The paper felt heavier than it should have. I unfolded it slowly, my hands trembling. "I can't stay anymore. I'm sorry." The words were simple, direct, but they carried the weight of everything he didn't say. My knees felt weak, and I sat down on the edge of the bed, the letter still clutched in my hand. The silence pressed in around me, loud and suffocating. I don't know how long I sat there, staring at those few lines of handwriting that felt like a final conversation. The front door opened and closed. My husband's voice called out from the kitchen, cheerful and oblivious. "You're up early," he said as he walked into the hallway. He paused when he saw me sitting there, the note still in my hands. His smile faded. "What's that?" he asked, stepping closer. I couldn't speak. I just handed him the note. His face changed as he read it. The warmth drained from his expression, replaced with something I couldn't quite name. Confusion, sadness, or something darker. "He's gone." His voice was quiet, almost disbelieving. I nodded, unable to form any words. He sat down beside me, the bed creaking under his weight. We sat in silence for what felt like an eternity, the note resting between us like a physical reminder of everything that had slipped through the cracks. "He didn't even say goodbye," my husband muttered, more to himself than to me. I wanted to tell him that maybe some goodbyes are too hard to say. Maybe leaving without a word was the only way he could handle it. But I stayed quiet. My husband let out a long, slow breath and stood up. "I'm going to call him." His voice was steady, controlled, like a man holding himself together by sheer willpower. I stayed behind, still sitting on the bed, staring at the empty space where he used to be. I knew he wouldn't answer the phone. I knew it was too late. The house felt emptier than it ever had before. The same walls, the same furniture, but everything felt hollow. I could hear my husband in the living room, pacing as he tried to call. Each unanswered ring felt like a reminder that we'd lost him, not just physically, but in a deeper, irreversible way. I stood up and walked back to the kitchen, pouring myself a cup of coffee out of habit. My hands were steady now, almost unnervingly calm. I stared out the window at the backyard. The soil was still turned from the day we spent gardening, half finished and abandoned, just like everything else. The phone stopped ringing. My husband's footsteps approached. He didn't speak, just leaned against the counter next to me. His shoulders were tense, and his jaw was set, but I could see the helplessness behind his calm exterior. "We'll figure this out," he said finally, though it sounded more like a question than a promise. I nodded, though I didn't believe it. We stayed like that for a long time. Two people standing in the same space but feeling miles apart. The quiet settled in again, and I wondered if it would ever leave. He left with no real goodbye. And as much as I tried to make sense of it, part of me knew that goodbye was never really meant for him. It was meant for me. The morning light spilled through the kitchen window, soft but sharp enough to remind me that another day had come. The house was silent, heavier than ever. I hadn't slept much, but I'd managed to hold myself together longer than I expected. My husband sat in the living room, the TV on low, though he wasn't watching. The phone lay next to him, dark and still. No missed calls. I took a slow breath and reached for another cup of coffee when I heard the front door creak. My heart skipped. I turned quickly, half expecting to see him standing there. But it wasn't him. It was the mail carrier, slipping an envelope through the slot before disappearing down the street. The envelope lay on the mat, plain and unassuming. But as I picked it up and turned it over, I froze. My name was written across the front in familiar handwriting, his. I stared at it for what felt like forever before I peeled it open, my hands trembling. Inside was a single page. I unfolded it carefully, feeling the weight of it before I even read the words. I know leaving like that wasn't fair. I didn't know how else to do it. I thought staying was the answer, but all it did was hurt both of us. I needed to breathe. But I didn't leave because of you. I left because of me. You've been stronger than you think, even when I made things unbearable. I never wanted to be the reason you felt trapped in your own life. My vision blurred, but I kept reading. I'll be okay. I don't know what life looks like next, but I need to figure it out. I hope you can forgive me even if it takes time. Don't carry this as your burden. It never was. The letter ended with two words that hit me harder than anything else. Thank you. I let the letter fall to the counter as I sank into the nearest chair. The silence in the room felt different. No longer heavy but open. The weight wasn't gone, but it shifted. I felt my husband's hand on my shoulder. I hadn't heard him walk in, but there he was, standing beside me. What did he say? He asked softly. I wiped at my eyes, holding up the letter without speaking. He read it slowly, his face calm but his eyes glassy. When he finished, he set the letter down gently, as if it might break. He'll be okay, he said, echoing the words on the page. I nodded, feeling something I hadn't felt in days, hope. It wasn't big or loud, but it was there. We stood together in that quiet kitchen, letting the morning settle in. The hurt wasn't gone, but the space between us felt different. Not healed but not broken either. A soft breeze drifted in through the window, carrying the scent of the garden outside. The mess we left behind didn't seem so overwhelming anymore. It would take time, but I knew we could tend to it again, one small piece at a time. And for the first time in days, I let myself believe that maybe we could grow something new.